Today we're diving into the great debate: crop sensor versus full frame cameras. The question that's on everyone's mind: is full frame really better than a crop sensor? A crop sensor could be a aps-c like Fuji, it could be micro four thirds like Olympus, a full frame like this Sony. That's what we're comparing. And as an amateur photographer myself, trying to up my game, I've been grappling with this question. So let's uncover the real truth and see which one comes out on top. First off, let's quickly define what we mean by a full frame and a crop sensor. Full frame sensors are the same size as traditional 35mm film, around 36mm by 24mm. Crop sensors, on the other hand, are smaller, typically in the aps-c or micro four thirds format. Canon's crop sensors are a tad smaller than the other brands, but they're all typically around the same size range. Now, you might be thinking, as I've thought, bigger is always better. Right? Well, not so fast. Each sensor size comes with its own set of advantages and disadvantages. And as I have both a crop sensor and full frame system, I can talk about all of this from personal experience. So with that said, let's break it all down point by point. Picture this. You're out in the wild trying to snap a photo of a majestic bald eagle soaring through the sky, but even with the longest lens, it's going to be just too far away. This is where crop sensors really shine. They have this nifty little thing called crop factor, which effectively increases your lens focal length. So, for example, let's say you slap a 50mm lens on a crop sensor camera. You're going to get a field of view, such as what you see in the frame, that is equivalent to an 80mm lens on a full frame sensor. It's like having a built-in teleconverter. And this is an absolute, genuine game changer for wildlife, sports, or any kind of photography that requires that extra bit of reach. And the best part, you can get more bang for your buck with your lenses as well. A 70 to 200mm lens on a crop sensor will give you the reach of around a 300mm lens on a full frame sensor, without the eye-watering price tag or the massive increase in size. But remember, this crop factor is a double-edged sword. If you're a landscape photographer, like me, who loves ultra-wide angles, you might find yourself struggling to get those sweeping wide, ultra-wide vistas with a crop sensor. For example, on my Fuji system, the 10 to 24mm wide angle lens, which is equivalent to around a 15 to 36mm on full frame, is known to be, well, not the greatest lens in the world, because it's working really hard to generate that wide angle on the smaller cropped sensor. But wait, there's more to the story than just reach alone. Let's talk about how these different sensor sizes perform when the lights go down. Alright, let's talk about shooting in the dark. And this is where full frame sensors really flex their muscles. The larger size of the sensor allows them to gobble up more light. And if the sensor has a similar megapixel count, the pixels on the full frame sensor are going to be bigger too. Imagine a pixel being a bucket that captures light. Obviously, the bigger the bucket, the more light that it's going to capture. This means less digital noise and better image quality at higher ISOs. So generally speaking, you're going to see a 1 or 2 stop improvement in low light performance with a full frame sensor compared to a cropped sensor. Now, I know that might not sound like a lot, but trust me, that can make a world of difference if you're shooting in a dimly lit cafe or you're trying to capture the Milky Way in all of its glory. But hold up, don't count out crop sensors just yet. Many newer aps-c cameras have been hitting the gym and seriously upping their low light game. With the improved sensors, some hardcore AI noise reduction either in camera or on your computer, you're probably going to be amazed at what they can do. And if you're used to shooting with a camera phone, a smartphone, a high-end crop sensor will still absolutely demolish it. It will knock your socks off. And speaking of socks being knocked off, let's move on to the next point that can really make your portraits pop. This is typically the big one, the big debating point between full frame and crop sensor cameras. So you know that silky, dreamy background blur that makes portraits look like they belong in a magazine. It makes them look professional. That's called Boker. And full frame sensors are the Boker masters. Without getting too technical, because a full frame sensor requires a longer focal length to achieve the same field of view as a crop sensor, you're going to get a shallower depth of field. The shallower depth of field, when you get it right on the person's eye that you're photographing, if you're doing portrait photography, means that the background is going to be blurred out. And if you are a portrait photographer, this is like hitting the jackpot. You can make your subject pop like they're in a movie scene, even with a slower lens. But if you're into landscapes or architecture photography, you might actually find it trickier to keep everything in focus with a full frame camera because that depth of field is going to be shallower. Now, I do a lot of landscape photography and I have to focus stack my images on my Sony full frame camera a lot more than I have to focus stack the images on my Fuji aps-c sensor. Focus stacking, if you're unfamiliar, is when you take multiple photos. This usually means a photo with your foreground in focus, then maybe another one with your midground in focus, and then another photo with your background in focus. Then you use Photoshop or whatever tool on your computer to blend this group of photos together so you create one image that is in focus from front to the back of the scene. And I often find that because my Fuji system has a deeper depth of field because of the smaller sensor, well, I rarely have to focus stack the images from that camera. Whereas if I'm close, or even somewhat close to a foreground on my full frame Sony, I have to photo stack those images more often. It's a bit of a pain in the ass, but it is what it is. Now, while we're on the topic of size, let's talk about something else that might affect your decision as to which camera system you want to invest into: the size and weight of the gear. Now, let's address the real elephant in the room: size and weight. Now, full frame camera bodies and lenses are generally bigger and heavier than their crop sensor counterparts. And if you're always on the go or you like to keep things light and nimble, a crop sensor setup might be your best bet. Think about it. Would you rather carry a big, bulky, full frame camera rig with you all day, every day, or a nice compact crop sensor camera that slips right into your jacket pocket? For me, very literally climbing up mountains every single week, trying to capture some light, most of the time it's a bit of a no-brainer. I'd rather save my back and enjoy the experience of shooting a little bit more. Because I'm an amateur, right? I don't need the ultimate picture quality. I just want something to stick up on my wall. And let me give you a real practical example. I'm off to Italy for my honeymoon in a couple of weeks. I'm going to be taking the crop sensor Fuji camera and Fuji lenses because they are literally half the weight of my equivalent Sony setup. So when I'm walking up and down to find compositions in the hopefully the blistering Italian heat, well, the last thing I want to be doing is sweating my ass off with a big, heavy, stupid camera bag. But on the flip side of that, if you're a studio photographer or you don't mind that extra bit of heft, a full frame setup might be worth the workout. There is one caveat to this though. Modern f4 full frame lenses are not actually that much bigger and heavier than a f2.8 lens on a crop sensor camera. And because of the 1 or 2 stops of light gathering performance improvement on full frame, it actually makes them quite similar in performance in the real world. And this is why you've got to be very careful in comparing different systems and lenses, because there are so many different options available. And more options and more competition, I think, is better for the marketplace that we're all buying into. But this is why it's worth sometimes going to a camera shop and seeing lenses, camera bodies, feeling them, picking them up, swapping them around to see what you actually are getting, as opposed to the renders that you see on a Sony website, a Fuji website, a Canon website, that are not always really representative of what you're buying, that you're going to be carrying around for years or decades on end. Now, whilst a smaller camera body might be easier on your back, there's another aspect to where bigger sensors can make a real difference. That is dynamic range and color depth. Dynamic range and color depth are another area where full frame sensors often have a leg up. The dynamic range refers to the range of brightness that a camera can capture, from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights. Color depth, on the other hand, is the amount of color information that a sensor can record. And in both cases, full frame sensors tend to outperform crop sensors. They can capture a wide range of brightness and more subtle color graduations, which gives you more flexibility in your post-processing. Let me get real practical here for a second. If you shoot a lot of high contrast scenes like I do, with sunsets and sunrises, where you've got the very darkest dark shadows at one end of the frame, and you've got this big bright ball of flaming gas exploding out towards you on the other end of the frame, or you really like to push your edits and really push what the camera sensor is capable of capturing, then a full frame sensor might be worth the investment. But again, crop sensors have come a long way in recent years. Many newer aps-c cameras have dynamic ranges and color depth that really do rival or surpass older full frame cameras. And to be quite honest, again, from me to you as an amateur photographer to amateur photographer, unless you're making huge prints or doing really heavy editing, you might not even be able to notice the difference. Basically, if you've bought a half-decent camera within the past few years, there's not really much of a gap between full frame and crop sensor here. So let me give you a real example. On my Sony a7R IV, the dynamic range is around 11.6 stops from darkest to lightest. On my Fuji X-T5 system, the dynamic range is around 10.4 stops, according to the excellent research done over at photonstophotos.net. It's pretty close between these two landscape photography beasts. Can I notice the difference when I'm editing? I think so, but I also might just be trying to convince myself one way or another. So whilst full frame sensors might have the edge, don't count out the capabilities of modern crop sensors. It's all about finding the right balance between your budget and your needs. And speaking of budget, that brings us to the final point that can make or break your camera and system and lens purchase decision. Let's be real, right? Photography is not really the cheapest of hobbies out there. You have to deal with equipment costs, travel costs, studio costs perhaps, and it goes on and on and on. And when it comes to full frame versus crop sense cameras, there's often a big difference in price. Full frame cameras and lenses can cost an arm and a leg, especially if you're eyeing up those super high-end models. Put it this way, you could buy a top-of-the-line crop sensor and a couple of sweet lenses for the price of one entry-level full frame body. From the aps-c side of things, the crop sensor side of things, that is a lot of bang for your buck. Of course, now, if money is no object and you're watching this video with 3 Leicas wrapped around your neck and you feel like you absolutely need the latest and greatest, go ahead, splurge on that full frame setup. But for most of us regular folks, a crop sensor camera will absolutely do the trick. You can get the camera and then start to invest in better glass and perhaps you upgrade to full frame further down the line if you really need to. So what is the verdict? Is full frame better than crop sensor? The answer is, and drum roll please, well, obviously it depends, right? If you shoot, and this is not what you aspire to do, but you right now genuinely shoot a lot of low light, portraits, or landscapes, you just need the absolute best image quality possible, then full frame is probably the way to go. You'll get better low light performance, shallower depth of field, and generally more flexibility in post-processing. But if you're into wildlife, sports, travel photography, or you just started out and you don't want to break the bank, then a crop sensor camera might be the better choice. You're going to get more reach, a more compact setup, and some serious savings as you make all these purchases as well. Essentially, and I think this is a fair way to put it, right? For anyone who isn't making money from their photography, almost any camera system from the past 5 years is going to be absolutely good enough. And let's be real here, just for a second. For most of the people watching this video, myself included, there are photos that have been taken on much crappier cameras than we would ever consider using, that have won all kinds of awards, accolades, and are just incredible, stunning photos. So for amateurs, it's very unlikely that your skills and your production, your work as a photographer are being held back by the camera system that you're using. And at the end of the day, the best camera is the one that you have with you and the one that you enjoy shooting with. So don't get too caught up in the gear race or better specs on paper. Focus on learning your craft, developing your style, and most importantly, getting off your arse, getting outside, and just having a bit of fun with it all. It's supposed to be a hobby after all, right? And remember, it's not the camera that makes the photographer, it's the photographer that makes the image. And if you'd like to continue your journey and take your skills to the next level, why not click the video that's on the screen right now? It's all about mastering metering in your camera so you can take more professional looking photos.